Welcome to Next to Madison, a podcast to help you live your best life.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Next to Madison. On today's episode, we are talking about a very important subject, touchy subject as well. We are talking about police reform. We've heard about this starting back in May, all the way through. We're still hearing about defund the police reform. But a lot of people don't understand exactly what that means. So my guest on the show today is the founder and CEO of American Institute for Police Reform. I might have butchered that, but Institute of American Police Reform, which is a nonprofit that he started to tackle this issue. He also has 25 years of policing experience in California. His last 3 years as a police officer, he was actually the chief of police. So he's very well versed in what this all means and what he's doing on his mission to change policing for the better. So with that being said, I want to bring on my guest, Nicholas Sensley. How are you?
Excellent, Madison. It's good to see you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. I'm excited that you get to come on and explain exactly kind of what this means exactly. So let's just start with that. Like, what is police reform exactly?
Well, again, thanks for having me, Madison. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this topic, which is really before so many of us in so many ways. And we've heard so much and so many terms being used to look at the issues that fundamentally come down to concern about how policing occurs in this country. So if we are looking at police reform, we at the Institute for American Police Reform like to look at it as in a very comprehensive way. We are guided by 5 pillars, which essentially look at what we believe are a full picture of policing, from the laws and policy, where changes and reform needs to occur there, in standards and training for policing, in accountability of police, in police leadership, and of course, most importantly, is the engaging of police in reform. So we are talking about reform that may look in some cases very dramatic and in other cases very sweeping, but we're looking at a systemic change in the way that policing is done. So the bottom line is that it's not just a piecemeal approach, which we have seen in the past under the banner of reform, which primarily focused on standards and training. We're looking at a complete systemic change. And at the risk of another overused word, systemic, but we are looking at a comprehensive change in the way policing is done.
So why do you think they originally got it wrong? Like, why wasn't this done years ago? Like, what happened that's causing a need for this?
Well, I think what's happening that causes a need for them probably points a great deal to the reason why I came into addressing this issue. I'd love to be able to say that this was something that I saw myself doing at this point in my more than 40 years of public life and public service in one form or another. But quite frankly, police reform is long overdue. What we believe where the failure has been in the past is that it has been narrowly focused on standards and training and aspects of accountability, but there hasn't been a complete look at all of the things that allow policing to occur as it does. And so when I got the call, and literally the call in many ways, because I've spent more than 2 decades around the world in the United States addressing issues of police ethics and police conduct and police leadership. The call to me was, essentially, Nick, what are you going to do about this? And
Yeah.
in a way, I can understand that call. And in answering it, my answer was the Institute for American Police Reform. And I'm very happy to say that that was validated by just a tremendous board of directors and partnerships from absolute wonderful law firms like Weil, Gottschalk, Manges, Hogan and Lovells, Bassbury Sims out of Nashville, organizations that have come along to say this matters and we need to do it
Yes.
right because it hasn't been done, and it needs to be done comprehensively, not just by the police, but by a more comprehensive approach to change.
So what was the current training? Like when you were training to be a police officer, what was that like at that time?
The training that I went through was much like the training that still exists. And
Mhm.
fundamentally, the training of police officers goes anywhere from 10 weeks to at most 36 weeks of training of police officers throughout the country. Now, granted, from that training, they go typically into another 10 to 20 weeks of on-the-job training, or what they call field training officer training. But you might want to contrast that to the fact that in many countries around the world that Americans in our mindset, we call developing or transitioning countries,
Uh-huh.
their police go through a police college before they're allowed to go onto the street and police, anywhere from 2 years to 3 years. For instance, in Taiwan comes to mind. I spoke once at the Taiwan Police College, as they refer to it. So the training in and of itself needs to change rather dramatically, in my opinion, because a lot of it is oriented around defensive measures and
Yes.
defensive tactics, driving in high pursuits, shooting and hand-to-hand defensive tactics. I mean, I taught at a sheriff's academy in Los Angeles for a portion of my career. So the training is a substantial part of reform, but as it has been approached in the past, it is not the end all of reform. It is only an element, or as we prefer to think of it, as one of the key pillars of police reform. I think of the chairman of my board of directors, who is a well-known oncologist, Dr. Heifetz, Dr. Larry Heifetz, asked me, he said, let me get this right, Nick, in understanding what goes through with policing. I spent 4 years in the university, 5 years in residency before I could write my first life or death prescription 9 years later. You mean to
Yes.
tell me that an individual, after 10 weeks, can walk out onto the street with the power of life and death? It seems to me, he says,
Wow.
that's a
Yeah.
little bit disturbing.
So is
So
one of
there's
the
something to be
things
reckoned there.
is one of the things you guys are working on is increasing the amount of time a police officer is trained prior to going on the job?
It would seem reasonable that that is part of the solution, that there needs to be a more comprehensive, again, I harken back to that word often, more comprehensive approach to the police officer's education. Because
Yes.
fundamentally at this point, when it really comes down to it, in 10 to maybe 36 weeks at the far end, and the average is around 10, mind you,
Okay.
that's a training program. What we need is a training and education program that looks at the full spectrum of that which a police officer will encounter with members of the community. Again, we don't want police to be doing things that they should not be doing, which brings us to the issue of defund the police, where we will, I'm sure, go. But we need to educate police officers so that they have a fuller, more comprehensive approach to community service rather than community enforcement.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that's like part of the police reform. But when people were saying defund the police, that was literally what it meant, was take away the amount of state money that was going to the police departments. And that happened in several large cities, and it resulted in crime spikes. Just recently, Minneapolis was, putting all this money together, or needed a bunch of additional funds because the crime was so high. So how do we, it's kind of it's a catch-22, it's like, how do we get these police officers who are serving the community and feel like they're part of the community, and the people feel that they're all together and that the police officers are there for them, not against them, but without stripping needed dollars to keep us safe?
You make an excellent point, because the issue of defund the police, using that rhetoric, has been really presented in many ways. And really defining what is meant by defund the police will really depend upon who is using that reference. And
Right.
so it's on the one hand, I don't want to throw away the impact that that call has made. It has been a rather significant rallying call that has really drawn the attention to policing like not before.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely,
However,
yeah.
yes, and so it is significant in that regard. However, if part of the inspiration for us starting the Institute was that we were concerned that there would be a lot of sort of knee-jerk reactions to changing what was wrong in policing. And so Minneapolis may be a very good example of that, because when you approach something that in a way that doesn't allow you to look at the root causes of the issues and take a more thoughtful and strategic approach to change, you're going to end up having to backpedal and change things in ways that perhaps, and maybe in the meantime, suffer through harm that
Mm-hmm.
was greater than what you were trying to fix. And so I'm afraid that that might be an example of what we're seeing in
Right.
Minneapolis, was that the non-strategic knee-jerk reaction of just taking away funding wasn't the answer. But I think that if we approach defund the policing from a perspective of, let's take out of policing those things that police perhaps should not be focusing their time and attention and resources to, and the funds that are attached to those efforts, and put them within the community into structured alternative approaches that are themselves problem-solving approaches, then the use of that term defund the police makes sense. And I might add, Madison, that there's probably hardly a chief of police or a police officer who would argue against that form of defunding the police,
Well,
taking
yeah,
away those things.
because if you think about it, if you've got somebody who's suicidal, a police officer isn't trained or equipped to properly deal with that, but they are the ones that come.
Yes, and
So putting that into a medical or a mental health expert would be great, and then obviously that frees up other things that the cops can be doing, and we get more focused on mental health. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
yes, in many respects, and also there is an aspect of where there is an appropriate relationship of the police to the response to mental illness. For instance, it should be police officers must be trained, must be aligned with the social services response to dealing with mental illness. It should not be a burden that primarily falls to policing. But sometimes there are scenarios in which a
Mm-hmm.
person who is struggling through mental difficulties, there's violence involved, and there are high risk, life endangered responses that requires a response to control that violence and to
Okay.
de-escalate that violence in a way that's safe and does not increase the risk to other persons involved. Now, that may very well be handled well by trained mental health professionals, and that's where it needs to rest. But it cannot be, just because we know this by experience, it cannot be to the complete exclusion of those officials who are trained to bring violent situations under control. But that training has to be beyond a mere forceful response. And I believe that in most cases, police are trained to deal with mental illness circumstances as a non-force issue, but rather as a de-escalation issue.
Right. So what's, the police, they do, the majority of police officers are really, really great people.
Yes, they
There's
are.
some
Yes,
bad
they are.
apples that we've experienced, and, that justice is being served for most of them. They're put in, people don't call the police when they're having fun, when life is good. They call the
This is
police
true.
when shit has hit the fan.
Yes.
So they're always responding to a very negative, typically violent situation. And they've got to protect not only the community and the people, but also themselves. So how is it that they're trained right now? Like if they show up to, let's say, a domestic violence situation and the guy's beating the crap out of his wife and then says, if you come near, or grabs a knife or even has a gun, how are they supposed to respond? Because most people would think, like, if you pull a gun on me, I've got to pull a gun on you. You always think, oh, why can't you just shoot him in the kneecap? But you kind of
Well,
got to shoot to kill in a way, right? Because it's your life is now threatened.
well, there is a measure of training that occurs, and a significant measure of training that occurs on de-escalation. The police are not fundamentally trained, I would hope, in most cases, to merely go into the circumstances as a force measure to use whatever means necessary to de-escalate or to bring the situation under control. There is a significant amount of de-escalation that goes on, and what needs to be the stronger emphasis in the training is this aspect of de-escalation. So let me give you an example, because there is a certain culture around policing that can be dangerous when it comes down to a rather defensive nature that is attached to policing. So a scenario in my policing career in that I came upon an active shooter scenario.
Okay.
I literally came onto a scene where an individual was actively shooting at people.
Oh my gosh.
I got out of my car, lights on, everything very clearly visible, calling out to this individual to stop. It was clear that the individual was not going to stop to me at the time. I decided to take the shot to stop this individual, who is a deadly individual, from killing people. Just as I made that decision, that individual turned and stopped shooting and began running directly at me. Now,
Oh, sure.
so the challenge here is, this is now becoming deadly for me, it would seem, right?
Yeah,
There's an
absolutely.
individual with a gun now running toward me. But here's the difference. I can see and I can assess, because trust me, Madison, your senses are highly on high level at this point.
Yeah, I
I
can
can see
imagine.
that this individual has no idea that I'm there, despite the fact that he's running directly toward me. He has his gun is lowered, he's running toward me, and I will say, I'll just be realistic about this, I have my weapon trained on him, and I was not going to miss should I have taken that shot.
Okay.
Now, it was on the final call to this individual, because ultimately I don't know what he's going to do. I don't know if he's coming to get me.
Yeah.
My final call to him was, in no uncertain and very colorful terms, to stop or he would be shot. The individual looked up at that point, immediately dropped his weapon, spread his arms out, and then allowed himself to fall face down onto the ground. He was taken into custody. The situation was brought under control. It turns out that one individual had been shot, but that was before I arrived on the scene. And all was brought under control. Now, here's
Wow.
the issue. That was a decision on my part of the necessity of taking the shot. Could I have taken the shot for fear for my safety? Yes. Would it have been lawful, permitted, and fully adjudicated as appropriate under the law? Yes. But the question, Madison, was it necessary? Now, let me take you to the picture of the culture.
Okay.
The culture of it was, hey, Nick, why didn't you take the shot, man? Were you scared? I mean, what? I mean, why didn't you take the shot? You could have. How did you know he wasn't going to take you out? Well, because I did not think it was necessary. Even further, prosecuting the case, the district attorney says to me, the prosecuting assistant attorney says to me, and I quote, "Why didn't you just shoot the son of a bitch? It would have been a whole lot easier." Now,
Interesting.
Madison, I got
Okay.
to tell you, that speaks to a very scary culture that can exist in this world around policing. And again, I'm so glad you mentioned there are great police officers in this country,
Oh,
absolutely wonderful police officers in this country. Our position is, it's not just a tagline, but it's the truth. Police are essential, but so is
absolutely.
police reform.
Very
So is
true.
police reform. Okay, so, but I point to this example to let you know that there is an underlying culture that has led to a lot of the shootings that we have seen. It, and a lot of it is driven by a fear culture. A lot of it is driven by over-militarization of the police. I mean, when we look at the deaths that have been out there, the George Floyd death, Rashad Brooks, the Daniel Prude, the Breonna Taylor,
Yeah.
Stephon Clark, we can go on, and there are many, many others. These are names that have been in the news.
Yeah.
There are a lot of questionable pieces of police work that are going on out there that are long overdue for reform.
Because it
As a
sounds
system.
like, based on that story you told, that it was kind of all the way up to the district attorney. It was just kind of this, not casual, but this, if you're in danger, just shoot them. But you were wise enough to say, I'm only going to shoot them if it's necessary. And you were able to calmly think. I feel like most police officers would have probably taken the shot. So yeah, that's the difficult part, where we do this reform, but what we're trying to accomplish is, how do we keep our community safe, the people in the community, but our police officers, because they're part of that community too. How do we ensure safety for everybody? And that's got to be the most difficult thing to do, is to have to, as a police officer, is to have to kill somebody.
And
You
you again make a beautiful point about the human side of the police officers involved. Again, wonderful people going home to wonderful families, to partners, to children, wonderful lives, and that's what they want to do in going home. They volunteered for a service that can be very thankless. We always tease that the firefighters get all of the glory and all of the love.
Right.
But
it's those calendars. You know what I mean? Like, you guys got to start taking, maybe that's police reform. Take your clothes off and do a calendar,
Well, and so it can be a very thankless service, but also there are communities who wrap themselves around the police officers and who are very
Yes.
thankful for the service that out there, and righteously so. But policing does have a history that is not necessarily very positive, and it's definitely not very positive for people of color. It's not very positive around issues of economic disparity that goes on. I can go on with stories from my personal experience in terms of encounters as a child with
Yeah.
policing. I mean, I was born in the 60s. I have very vivid images of police misconduct and literally terrorization of young men and boys in my neighborhood as a child. And so
Yeah.
there is a history that has impacted the present, and we have never really fully recovered from the history in policing. Therefore, again, I bring it back to acknowledging that police are essential, but so is police reform. But police reform has to
100%.
be done very well and very systemically.
So I know you're a newer organization. Um, have you guys been able to start accomplishing things? And how is reform actually happening, or is it something that the people keep talking about? Like, are there actual steps being done right now to change this?
Yes, thank you for asking that. We came about in June of last year, so we are a very young organization. But I got to tell you, Madison, one of the greatest affirmations that I received that this was the right thing to do
Uh-huh.
was the group of individuals and the organizations that have attached themselves to this effort with me. I mean, within 2 weeks, I had the greatest cadre of folks around me that I could have never imagined having it in.
That's
The law
awesome.
firm of Weil Gotshal and mine just out of New York came on as our pro bono attorneys within 3 weeks, just immediately. One
That's
of their
great.
top attorneys who was about to get an award from the American Bar Association, Steve Reese, now serves as my executive vice president and general counsel, came on board right away.
Uh-huh.
We have Hogan and Lovells, the 10th largest law firm in the world, as our pro bono partner, and along with one of the largest firms here in Nashville, Bass, Berry & Sims, on board with a number of other organizations. But the reason I mention these organizations, because each of these have taken on a significant role in the research that we are doing right now, because we really want to be very well grounded in evidence-based approaches to the reform that we are going to be recommending to the nation. Hogan and Lovells has already completed for us a very comprehensive state-to-state evaluation of police use of force. And trust
Okay.
me, there is some very, very telling information that has been found out of that. Bass, Berry & Sims has completed the first level of our qualified immunity research, because what we have been working to do is to answer two very fundamental questions that we hear from citizens when we see these shootings from police. And I'm just
Uh-huh.
going to put it in sort of the lingo in which we hear it. And that first question is, why is it that police get to do this sort of thing?
Right.
Right. And then the second thing is, because the way this is often adjudicated is, well, gosh, why did they get away with doing it the way they just did that? Because on the surface of things, if a person is killed by the police, particularly if you're looking at videos and situations like that, you go, gosh, that just looks wrong to me. And
Right.
then there are some that not only look wrong, that are wrong. And that's a position that I take with many of the recent vets that we saw in 2020 alone, let alone the ones that
Yes.
came before that.
Mm-hmm.
But what we have done very comprehensive research. We're going to be releasing our first public facing piece of that information coming up in the next few weeks for folks to go through our website, which, by the way, at www.americanpolicereform.org.
Okay.
It's very basic right now with the information that you can find out about us, but we're working this very day on revising and updating the website to put out some very public-facing information.
Yes.
So what's key for us on this, Madison, is that we want to bring the public on board. Engagement of the public in the reform process is a key pillar. And so the way to do that is we want to educate
Great idea.
and bring the public into this, because we can't just have police reforming the police, which has been, going back to one of your earlier points, which has really been kind of the historical context of how it's been done. Active
Right.
duty or retired of police, et cetera, are those who have been doing what has been called reform. At our institute, we've approached that very differently and much more holistically, the approach that we're taking to reform.
So will you guys, now that you have the research and these great partners, will you then be dealing with different municipalities to put these findings and these trainings kind of into their programs?
Now there is the million-dollar question. So there are 18,000 plus police departments,
Right.
almost 18,000 police departments
Yeah.
in this country with almost 1 million persons involved in policing. How do you get to reform at this level? Well, let me back up a little bit and paint a picture of what our reform looks like when it comes to the actual execution on it, in that we can't go to 18,000 police departments. That's a reality. No one can do that. But we can go to 50 states. Because see, what happens is that our Constitution gives the right to states to govern policing within its borders. In other words, the federal government can't come in and say, this is how we will police in America, and every state has to police this way. Federal government can come in and take a look at how that's been done with regard to civil rights, but it can't set the standard for policing. So the problem with that right is that you've got 50 different states doing 50 different ways of policing. What we intend to do is push through our advocacy and our work with the states for more standardized forms of policing in America. Here's another example of why the current system is problematic. Our research on police use of force done by Hogan and Lovell shows that 6 of the 50 states, and this is as of November of last year when we completed that layer of the research, 6 of the 50 states do not even have laws on the books that address police use of force at all.
What?
Yes. See,
what are, can you
that
mention some of the, can you mention those states or?
Well, at the time, one of the states, for instance, was Virginia. Another of them was Vermont, although I think that Vermont has meant to work on making some changes in that regard. I would have to pull up the data sheet. I don't have it before me.
Yeah, no problem.
But also, even among 12 of the 50 states, including those that do have laws to address police use of force, 12 of them have no laws on the books to address deadly use of police force. I mean, when you think about that, Madison, it's not only interesting, it's scary. And
right, so it's like there was no repercussions for their actions, so they didn't need to necessarily, maybe,
well, there may be repercussions, but there's no guidance. It's sort of left to judging it after the fact, which is always going to occur even in states that have the laws. But where there is no guidance, that means there is no standards. And so what we really hope to achieve ultimately, part of our vision is uniform standards of policing throughout the United States. That's not an unreasonable expectation. So if I, as a badge-carrying former law enforcement officer, for instance, if I get pulled over in California where I did my 25 years of policing, I'm pretty comfortable in most areas of the state, knowing predictably what's going to happen when I get pulled over. I, like you, probably going to be a little bit nervous still because nobody likes to get pulled over by the
No,
police.
no.
But for the most part, I'm going to be okay. Well, there are some states, and I'm not going to call out the states, that if I'm getting pulled over, especially as an African American man, I'm feeling a little bit uncomfortable because,
I don't blame.
especially with what I know now, but even through my
Right.
life experience, I'm a little bit more uncomfortable. And in some places, I'm a lot more uncomfortable than I am, say, in California or in some of the places where I have a higher level of confidence about the training that the police officers receive. And
Yeah.
Madison, that's unfair. That's inappropriate. We are the United States of America.
Yes.
And therefore, for this most visible, this most deadly form of authority in the day-to-day life of everyday citizen, it should be predictable. It should be reasonably predictable as to how that officer with such high level of
Yes.
authority is going to approach you in that contact. But it
So
isn't.
that brings a good question. How do we fix just, it's not fair that somebody of your skin color feels more scared simply because of that. How do we change that?
It is a complicated issue because it is not just a policing issue. It is a societal issue.
Mm-hmm.
And police are members of the broader society of citizens. And so we take police from within society who are going to bring the package of representations into police work that we see in the broader society. So I will say on the first level of change, it is something that we all have to take responsibility for both the history and the attachment to racism that occurs within this country. And that occurs in many forms. There's racism on the basis of the colors of skin. There are all sorts of, ethnic. We have poverty bias that's involved in policing because we have poverty bias that's involved within societies. If a poor kid walks into a rich neighborhood, then people are going to be looking at that kid askant with the thoughts that, what's he up to? I'm going to go ahead and call the police because he doesn't, quote, belong here in this neighborhood. Okay, and so there's a societal issue that needs to be changed, and then there is a culture which in policing, which is a part of police history. Keep in mind that the first organized police force was slave patrol, right? And the idea was
I did not know that.
Well, many people don't know that. Okay, and so, but part of the history of policing was its initial, the first 5 or 6 police departments that were organized policing that occurred in America was around slave patrol. And from slave patrol, it went into being basically protection for corporations. And then it became an issue of law and order. And then law and order ultimately came down to the policing of classes of people, which in many cases in the history of our country, that meant that people of color were seen as a threat. So we have an evolution of racial issues. Again, that's both a societal issue and is a issue within police departments. And a large measure of the reflection of racism that we see in police is because we see that there's that bias that says, this person doesn't belong, or this person is different and is a threat. One other quick example. In my first field training program experience in policing, my first argument with my field training officer was because a Black male driving a Porsche drove past us as we were setting up our equipment to go on duty. And my field training officer said, hurry up, we got to get going. We got to stop him. There's no way that he should be driving that car. My response was, what? What the hell? So you're telling me because he's a Black man, he doesn't get to drive a Porsche? And so
Oh my
this is
God.
okay. So there is this mentality around quote belonging or right to or fit that is a part of the bias that is created. And when you add to that a high level of training that is oriented around the protector, the savior, the enforcer,
Okay.
you get a group of people who come into many encounters already hyped up and both afraid for their own safety and afraid for the safety of others at perhaps an elevated level that in many ways diminishes their capacity to work toward de-escalation more effectively. So you take the Metropolitan Police of the UK, those guys don't have guns. So you can bet they're really good at
They don't?
de-escalation. No, and
I
so,
didn't know that.
the bobbies, as we call them in the UK, aren't armed. They have what they called armed police, which is a special deployment of the police force
Okay.
in the UK, but or in England, and so it distinguishes from the average officer on the street who's unarmed. Now, granted, there aren't nearly, I mean, not even close to the number of firearms in the UK as they are here in the United States. And
Right.
so, but on the other hand, that doesn't mean they don't face significant threats. One of the big things that you can look when you do searches on the problems in the UK is the use of knives. And there in the U.S. we're trained. Hey, look, you don't take a stick to or a billy club to a knife fight. Well, that's what the guys in the UKs are doing, and so those guys know de-escalation really well. And we need to do more around our de-escalation skills here in American policing and come away from this heavily fortified. I dare say that the American police, the average American police officer, is more equipped to kill than the soldiers in Vietnam, than the average soldier in Vietnam. Think about it.
Really?
The average
Wow.
police officer on the street has in that patrol car, first of all, he's got a very nice vest, which is great. I'm glad to have. They have, these helmets that are, ballistic helmets. They have M16s and shotguns all in one patrol car. These individuals
Okay,
are
interesting.
heavily armed. And granted, again, we have a heavily armed society, and we don't want police officers to not be able to defend themselves in deadly scenarios.
Yes, absolutely.
But we are building a force of heavily armed individuals in policing in America. And when you do that, it builds a mentality around the use of force that makes it easy to escalate.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, people, I think you're when you see a gun or there are guns involved or, things just kind of change or there's all that protective equipment. It just kind of maybe, but obviously we've got to keep our citizens safe, but we got to keep our police safe. So you're in a very difficult but amazing position because you're really making much needed change, which is great. I mean, if somebody put me in charge, let's say I was the president, how fun would that be? I would say, okay, let's meet with all the people of all the states, the congressmen. And I would say, okay, here's a great training packet. We'll incentivize you through federal funding to use this and stick to this type of training. Let's see how
I
it
tell you,
goes.
that sounds really great. I mean, I'm beginning to think, okay, Madison for president here.
Yeah, am I doing? You have like, guys, it's very simple.
Right.
Just everybody do the same thing for this. We need results.
You're on point, though, in terms of what it takes. We do need to, and this is our approach. We do need to go to the states. We need to advocate for changes in the law. We need to advocate for changes in standards of training and for overall standards for accountability. We need to work on police leadership, and we need to work on more direct engagement of community, not just what we have labeled community-oriented policing in the past, but true engagement of citizens. And so the federal government can be a great incentivizer. And I certainly hope that the new administration will be willing to work with the Institute for American Police Reform, and we've definitely been in contact with them, and they're very hopeful for being able to work with this new administration, and we're very hopeful where we can get. But we have to be careful about how we incentivize, because in the past, the way that the federal government has incentivized was says, do what we tell you to do, and we'll give you tanks and machine guns and armored personnel carriers. And that hasn't worked out quite so well. So we have to really
because then it maybe feels like a dictatorship.
Well, again, the federal government has limited control over how policing occurs at the state level. The states are completely responsible for local policing, but the state can regulate training. They can regulate authorization of policing and how it occurs in its state. They can write the laws, change the laws, remove the laws, update the laws on policing. And this is a part of the work that we will be doing. So bottom line, when it comes down to it, is we're going to be reminding folks that we need policing in America, but we need to change how it's done so that it is very, very much oriented around the value of human life, the value of human dignity, and the approach to service.
Absolutely, because I think so many people forget, and it's society is very dangerous. The stuff we're fed, the images we see, the news, all this stuff, it's like training us to kind of think a certain way, kind of where we grew up. But we all have to remember at the end of the day that we're all one. We're all part of a universe. We're all God's children, whatever you believe. So we need to stop letting people separate us. Because I feel like that's maybe what the government's kind of done, is they've like divided us. And we also need to work on people seeing that we're all just part of, whether you're rich or you're poor, different races, different religions, like we're all the same, and that's where people forget. And it's going to be very hard to change that. And I don't think we'll change that in my lifetime. I know that, you show up to, let's say for me, it's like you show up to a really exclusive party and you don't fit in. And it's people are always experiencing some sort of thing where they're feeling kind of pushed away. So that would be.
We're very good about drawing lines, aren't we?
Yeah.
And separating out.
Exactly. People just need to remember, like, hey, we're all the same. We're all connected. All our consciousness is all connected up in the universe, and we're all part of this world. And each one of us has like a purpose and things of that. I mean, I know that sounds like a fantasy and a fairy tale, but I think constant reminders about that. But that leads me to my next question for you, before we kind of wrap up, which is, how can people get involved to help?
Well, thanks for asking that, Madison. I mean, I was very deliberate about forming this as a nonprofit institute. In other words, it's a public interest institute. We are doing this for the sake of the change that's necessary. So I would like folks to remember that we are a nonprofit organization.
Okay.
And so we are advocating for engagement around this issue. We really need people to be behind us and in support of what we're doing. We would like people to go to our website, go to our contact page, and send out the message to us, letting us know that they're behind us, they're willing to support us, both in the skills that they may have to volunteer and to support us financially. And as we are a nonprofit organization, and you can't get things done without public funding and support being behind it. We, again, the asset that we have is that we are approaching this holistically. We're approaching this as a community health issue. We're approaching it from the perspective of both the civil law and of the criminal law. We're approaching it through education. We're looking at the issue of labor and unions, and of course, the various level of community engagement and advocacy at the grassroots level. We're having to do a national movement, Madison. This is not just another single pole effort. This is a national movement to unify this nation around a picture of good policing for this country.
Which is just so needed.
Yes.
Yeah, you've got a great mission ahead of you, an uphill battle, but anything worth doing and changing is always going to be a challenge at first. So I will definitely see where, I can help you out in any way. And if you guys are listening, this really resonated with you and you want to make a difference, you can go to AmericanPoliceReform.org, correct?
Yes.
And then,
correct.
and again, that'll be on our website with all his information. So you can quickly find that at nexttomadison.com. Is there anything you want to add before we part ways?
Well, again, I just really thank you for the opportunity, Madison, to speak with you and to share across with your followers and the audience. For folks to recognize that we do appreciate the work that is being done by the many men and women in policing in America as a wonderful and necessary service.
Yes.
We don't want to put police officers, police officials, and those in the policing world on the defensive about what we are trying to accomplish through reform. We fundamentally believe that in the end of it all, very comprehensive, very systematic reform is going to be good for the police and it's going to be good for society. So we're asking folks to come on board, get behind us, support us, speak about us, to share this presentation, go to our website, and let's just get the word out that police are essential and so is police reform.
Yes, exactly. They perfectly go together, right? Well, thank you so much. You guys, my guest, Nicholas Sensley. Did I say that right? I always feel like I'm going to butcher people's names.
Thank you, Madison.
But no, I really appreciate it. And you guys listening at home, at the gym, on the road, wherever you may be, I appreciate you tuning into another episode of Next to Madison. And we'll see you next time to find out who's next.
Hey, your host here, Madison Malloy. Please make sure to subscribe to the show on all podcast platforms and please rate and review us on iTunes and Spotify. Also, if you have any questions or comments, you can email us at contact@nexttomadison.com. I thank you again for listening. Bye.